my English is not so good, and so I use some writings from my essay on the catalogue of Chillida, who was very good opportunity for me to study and to write on Chillida. The gravitational field is not diffused through space. The gravitational field is that space itself. This is the idea of the general theory of relativity. Space is no longer something distinct from matter. It's one of the material components of the world, an entity that undulates, flexes, curves, twists, but it's not only space that curves, time does too. The whole of space can expand and contract. There is no such thing as a real void, one that is completely empty. It's possible to imagine the world's basic particles having brief and ephemeral existences, continually created and destroyed by this trembling. This is the world described by quantum mechanics and particle theory, a world of happenings, not of things. Space is created by the linking of these individual quanta of gravity. Once again, the world seems to be less about objects than about interactive relationships. This is not Chillida, he is a scientist from Italy, a very good scientist, Carlo Rovelli, but I think it's very interesting to start from this because the keywords here present, space, matter, time, void, trembling, happenings, and relationships, are practically the same keywords describing Eduardo Chillida's work, whose exploration of space and matter leads to a wonderful mise-en-scène of the fundamental principles of modern physics. These principles have gradually eroded the false certainties of determinism and positives underpinning Western civilization. Principle constantly examined too by the phenomenologist philosophers, from Husserl to Heidegger, from Bachelard to Merleau-Ponty, with whom Chillida had significant relationship over the years, as we listened before. These Chillida's words, you can read, accurately reflect the various stages of his unflagging exploration at the limits of the unknown, and his bold attempt to represent the interstitial that lies in the cracks between space and matter, to discover and reveal through the tools of art that precede and transcend the boundaries of science, not the factual, but the potential. As a sculptor, of course, his quest is pursued through the material, stone, alabaster, iron, concrete, clay, or even paper, but his ultimate goal is to capture and reveal empty space. We saw it. Not so much the external space or the space surrounding the world, but rather the space intimately embedded within it. While Michelangelo sought the pre-existing forms of the statues in shapeless blocks of marble, Chillida seeks the shape of the space within the material, with no preconceived design. Thus, instead of removing the surrounding material, he digs and excavates inside it. Or in his iron pieces, he applies the force of fire and hammer, bending and forging the material in order to calm the wind or open up a passage for the light. So Chillida stresses the need to look further than the pillars of Heraclius, to go beyond what is known, to dare to disobey established rules and transcend acquired truths. He writes these words is very interesting. I am not an outlaw. It's very, very, very thin, good to see this idea. Chillida is thus engaged in a process of tireless research, going beyond certainties and applying systematic doubts with a view not to questioning acquired knowledge, but to paving the way to new discoveries, ignoring stability, but instead exploring instability. And for this reason, I think it's interesting for architects. Where did man unearth this notion of stability? Surely stability is the most unnatural and contrary to life of all concepts. Our word of Chillida, explicitly defending the view that knowledge is to be pursued through the process of living, and thus through profound bodily immersion, and not just through abstract processes of reasoning. This is a highly modern point of view, in my view, and one which not only echoes the outlook of contemporary scientific research, but also in terms of its emphasis on spaces and relationships, informs high-profile contemporary approaches to architecture. But let us return to those key words and to Eduardo Chillida's interpretation of them: space, matter, and time are concepts requiring examination through sculpture, which can chart the boundaries between their domains and the possible dialectical relationships between them. They demand a dynamic reading of space, or better still, an exploration of space-time. As Cosme de Baragnano has noted, Chillida knows that space is created by action, by a dynamic force. This approach prompts him to delve, to excavate more deeply into the limit between space and matter, into that two-dimensional interface or film which he compares with the present. You said before, intermediate between past and future. Yet just as in the full empty dialectic of Taoist thought, the two terms, full and empty, justify each other and need each other. They may even overlap. Matter may yield inner space to emptiness thus giving its shape, while emptiness as an undeniable materiality is a subject on which Chillida has often reflected. And this was his mention of this full empty dialectic. As indicated earlier, Chillida interprets the void not as an immobile nothingness, but as an immaterial yet dynamic fullness, shaped and quickened by trembling, by vibration, by processes and happenings or events triggered by energy, light, fire, heat, movement, sound, waves, tensions, gravitational and magnetic fields. In short, by a whole universe of physical relationships and haptic sensation which fill the void, thus turning it into matter, an immaterial matter. This concept of a vital, existential, bodily void stand, in my opinion, in sharp contrast to the sculptural research by another great Basque artist, Jorge Oteiza, who always maintained that his work was a search for a metaphysical void, caught and frozen in a state of stillness. It should be stressed that the void in Chillida's sculpture is extracted from matter, or better, still carved out of matter. It's a dynamic or energized space, whereas the void in Oteiza's sculptures is a void constructed ex nihilo in a laboratory, and thus is, as he says, deoccupied space, immobilized to yield a deliberately static result. This appeared to me the fundamental difference between these two great sculptures from the Basque Country. I want to do very slowly an architectural parallel with Chillida's research, which may be proposed with the pioneering stereotonic architecture by the Portuguese architect Manuel Mateus, in which the dialectic between space and matter assumes absolute importance. And it's interesting also, Mateus used a type of description by drawing very, very similar to Chillida. Chillida himself has provided a brilliant overview of his concept of space, but we saw before from Michael, and so I don't stop here. We can go to the architectural spatial relationship of Chillida. It was mentioned he was a young, talented goalkeeper for the Real Sociedad, and so Chillida himself has often hailed this useful activity as a kind of sentimental education for the profession of sculpture, activating the ability to control the spatial dynamics of the playground, and so also for the sculpture. And so this football metaphor also applies perfectly, I think, to the spatial strategy required for a modern architect trained to measure and dominate space, to project it as a function of his vision and perception, not with classical instruments, Euclidean geometry or Cartesian coordinates, or the monofocal static rules of central perspective, but with more modern tools such as topology, parallax, and in general non-Euclidean geometry. So taking into account the relationship between the architectural space and the users, their perception, their multisensory haptic experience, their movement in space, in short, their spatial relationships. I compared in some cases with the work of Stephen Hall, the American artist. So, Chillda's work, particularly the monumental public art we saw before, produced from the 70s onwards, undoubtedly testifies to his strategic skill in interpreting and designing spatial relationships, faithfully transferring the vision underpinning his sculpture work to an exquisitely architectural scale and dimension. In doing so, he succeeds in mastering spatial relationships with the external environment, of engaging with the components of landscape, light, horizon, sea, sky, or elsewhere with the architectural features of the urban context in which he operates. In a way, it's a real site-specific approach in his work. From the three great commemorative public art projects in the Basque Country we saw before also, to his monumental sculpture in Gijón, Madrid, Barcelona, Seville, and also in Germany, and we saw just now. All these open-air sculpture projects produced through a long career have profoundly affected their urban and landscape setting, shaping it with remarkable insight. Of course, the major sculptural group in San Sebastián, the Peña del Viento, with the close collaboration from the architect Luis Peña Gancelli, is probably his great architectural landscape work of art, endowed with a fascinating power which serves to highlight the sublime force of the wind, the rocks, and the ocean waves. The three huge curved steel cones embedded in the rocks at the very edge of the coastal terracing designed by Peña Gancelli resemble powerful pincers trying in vain to catch and trap the wind whilst pointing out to the ocean horizon. On stormy days, we saw before, the holes in the pink granite paving of the esplanade are filled with columns of wind and water, which give off a dull, organ-like sound. It's a multisensorial landscape. So nature and artifice combine to create a sublime landscape sculpted simultaneously by three classical elements: the fire that forged the steel sculptures, the air and wind that have polished the rocks, and the water, the waves that sometimes flood the terrace esplanade. The rocky coastal landscape of the edge of the bay has become as much a landmark in the urban geography of San Sebastian as the huge promontories of Mount Igueldo, Mount Urgul, and the island of Santa Clara, as much a point of reference as that other powerful piece of geographic architecture later built by Rafael Moneo on the second urban bay at the mouth of the river Urumea in Gros. The new Cursal Concert Hall, which has the form of two leaning lighthouses or breakwaters, and is in a way a similar significance for the landmark of the bay. The second major urban project undertaken in Vitoria with Peña Ganchegui, we saw before in 79-80, was in this other Basque city, and involved the design of a new square, the Plaza de los Fueros. In this setting, the project comprises an internal spatial arrangement of elements hewn out of the paving of the square. An almost hieroglyphic sacred temenos. We are in Athens, and we can speak of temenos, constructed from within. A profound, tormented omphalos, and other Greek terms, celebrating and laying bare the roots of the Basque people. Like most of Chillida's monumental projects, the city-scale intervention was drawn on an earlier model, which was an alabaster sculpture of 1975, significantly entitled Gasteiz, the Basque name of the city. So, here Chillida creates a labyrinth of passageways echoing the narrow streets of a medieval city, but at the same time perhaps recalling the hollow shapes left by a tree's roots into the ground. The third monumental project in the Basque Country we saw before, our father's house in Guernica. Here, yet again, the work engages with the surrounding landscape. Chillida's concrete sculpture or architecture gives form to a house or a temple with its own independent sacred space, which rather than closing in on itself, engages closely with the vegetal landscape, opening out to establish an intense visual relationships, in particular with the sacred oak of the Basque people, which grows in front of the Assembly House in this famous town of Guernica. So, in terms of basic constructional principles, the Guernica project bears a certain similarity to the Haus für Goethe in Frankfurt. It shares a comparable setting, an equally complex geometry, an elliptical ground plan you described very well before. And so here the volumes are even more open, and this dynamic engagement with the surrounding park seems to draw deliberately on aspects of Goethe's scientific thought and his morphological studies, more than the poetry of Goethe. Perhaps Chilida's imposing piece of public monumental art was in 1999 this reinforced concrete sculpture produced in collaboration with the engineer José Antonio Fernández Ordóñez, significantly named In Praise of the Horizon. It stands atop Saint Catalina Hill in Gijón, looking over the ocean, and the space here opening out onto the landscape assumes truly cosmic proportion. The sculpture provides a surprisingly dynamic framework which envelops the visitor and focuses in a sequence of views like a film on the ocean horizon. It acts, as Cosme de Baragnano suggested, as a visor, a dynamic, rotating visor. So, yet the undeniable cosmic significance of this sculpture is at the same time wholly human. Chillida is not pursuing the metaphysical religiosity of the Cromlech, for example, sought in other ways by Oteiza. He is rather constructing a spatial device capable of stirring emotions in the visitor and providing the user with the means of appreciating the power of the surrounding landscape according to the shifting patterns of light, wind, and horizon. How huge and powerful as a geographical landmark, this sculpture object is in reality no more than a device at the disposal to the real protagonist, which is the space, again, and here specifically the landscape space. It's interesting to note that 1 year before, the still young American architect Stephen Hall designed a conceptually similar architectural device to be placed at the edge of the desert in Phoenix, Arizona, which was named Spatial Retaining Bars, inspired by Elie Siski's constructivist building of Rome. Then, in a way, realized by him, Stephen Hall, more recently in China. To mark the Universal Exposition in Seville, we saw before another imposing reinforced concrete sculpture endowed with considerable symbolic and civil significance just on the bank of the river Guadalquivir. This monument to tolerance can be seen yet again, I proposed, as a rational device seeking to establish multiple relationships with the city, the wharf, the Triana Bridge, the river itself, thinking to Chillida's interest for music. I thought that this piece could be regarded as a tuning fork, or on one hand, seeking to harmonize and engage the various cultures which over the centuries had sway in Seville, and on the other, uniting and embracing the varied urban landscapes surrounding it. And we saw also another intervention aiming at geographical and urban triangulation. Produced also in 1992, but inaugurated in 1994, and it was the strategic placing of this small stele entitled Embrace, as you mentioned, for the memory of Rafael Ruiz Balerdi in San Sebastian. And this tribute offers a new scope for a concrete strategic rereading of the geographical and urban coordinates of old La Concha Bay. Its location on the slopes of the garden at the Palacio de Miramar, whose terraces dip down to the sea, effectively enables the viewer to chart from a distance the relationships between the essential elements of the bay, explored 20 years earlier with the Peine del Viento, so returning to play a role in the geographical implant of San Sebastian, which is really so nice. In all his site-specific pieces, Chillida skillfully transcends the rigid barriers of Euclidean geometry, as I said before, and also the Cartesian spirit, to construct his own geometries and architectures, which are unarguably heterodox, a word he uses often. This vindicate the views and methods of much modern and contemporary architecture, sharing his interest in spatial dynamics and topology against the finizio, to use a term of Leon Battista Alberti, of the architecture object. And this is interesting for thinking to the idea to be an architect of Chillida, because in reality he refused the academic architecture in Madrid in that time, but he had a vision of the new architecture in reality, and this is very interesting for us. Just to go to the conclusion, I think the real revelation of Chillida as an architect dates back to the latter years of his tireless research and his final discovery of the formative function of empty space, of that primal hidden core which lies embedded in matter, of which we spoke before. That exploration, whose earliest manifestation are to be found in his alabaster sculpture of the late 70s, like In Praise of Light, In Praise of Architecture, and so on, and specifically in this fantastic piece, which is Mendihus in Basque, it means empty mountain. Here Chillida hews out a chamber of air and light inside a solid block of translucent material. The appearance is that of a mirage-like immaterial architecture within formless matter. And it was this intuition, this search, which continued through a long series of works entitled Lo profundo es el aire, the verse of Guillen before remembered, that perfectly defined that internal, hidden, hollow space we commented before. So this series gave rise to countless variants, generally an amorphous material pierced and gouged out with light, airy space, to create a place by removing matter, as said Cosme de Baragnano, and inserting space. This simple yet profound discovery of hollow inner space is the core principle informing architectural research from ancient time to the present day, and engages with the concepts of stereotomy in stark contrast to the notion of tectonics currently championed by the critic Kenneth Frampton, referring to a previous Gottfried Semper's theories. And a leading Spanish architect, Alberto Campo Baeza, explained well this concept with the words you can read here. I understand stereotomic architecture as a massive, stony, weighty architecture which settles down on the earth as if it had been born there. It's an architecture that seeks light, that perforates its walls so that light may enter. Is the architecture of the podium, the plinth, the stelobate, is in short the architecture of the cave, and is perfect to define also Chirida's work. These are this work. I'm going to the conclusion. With his background in sculpture, Chillida perfectly understands the key role that can and should be played in stereotomic architecture by the pulviscular matter of air and by the penetration and shifting nuance of sunlight. In fact, the void within this hollow space is not empty at all. It's full of the energy, the tension triggered by the very properties of physical spaces we remembered before: light, heat, sound, and so on. And so it's what finally enabled the constant interplay of tensions and perception to which our senses are alert with when experiences this space. Light is a crucial factor in this stereotomic architecture, constructed by removing matter. Only light can bring life to these spaces and enhance their meaning, from the flickering lights and shadows of Plato's cave to the prehistoric caves and the Mycenaean Ptolemy to the Pantheon in Rome. So the dream of a real architectural cave on a gigantic scale, deeply inside a mountain, adumbrated in the sculpture Mendy Hoots, came close to fulfillment in the late 20th century when Chillida, working in close collaboration with the engineer Fernandez Ordóñez, designed this huge space full of air and light inside the Mount Tindaya on the island of Fuerteventura in Canary Island, with the magnificent aim of giving a complete shape to the stone pouring operation planned for the mountain, and thus imagining to turn the quarry into a sort of work of art. And it was really a fantastic project. It was the project which approached me to the architecture of Chile.
It is unfinished.
Yeah. This attainable utopia met, of course, with insuperable obstacles, although it still remains a fantastic visionary sculpture and architecture project. And Chillida himself commented, "Form springs spontaneously from the needs of the space that builds its dwelling, like an animal its shell. Just like this animal, I am also an architect of the void." It's fantastic. You know? This Tindaya project would have meant the extreme materialization on a monumental scale of the shell of this great architect of the void. Although this project never came to fruition, Chillida was able to give concrete expression to that architecture of the void, not on a giant universal scale, but on a much smaller and domestic scale in his caserio or farmhouse in Zabalaga, the focal point of the Chillida Leku Museum. Here, a traditionally built Basque country house provided the sculpture architect with the chance to implement a project requiring wholesale hollowing out, leaving visible only the structural lines of force of the inner space. I compared in my essay this work with some architecture and restoration by Eduardo Souto de Moura in Portugal, for example. It's very, very interesting. The caserio has really become the ancestral shell of the animal with which Chillida, the architect of the void, identified. A shell able to preserve and to exhibit his work, his very soul, even after his death. And this is the conclusion. Thank you very much.
We really need